Hello YouTube. First of all, apologies for the lack of content this month. I have been very busy. Also, you will notice that I had a haircut. I don't really have anything to say about that, but it would kind of be the elephant in the room if I didn't mention it. So I'm mentioning it and now I'm moving on. What I wanted to talk about in this video is metaethics, because I had what many people, I suppose, would consider a significant change in my view. Now, I actually don't think that I really did have a significant change. I don't think the change was that significant. But, I did change my mind. I used to be a non-cognitivist, and now I'm an error theorist. So I did change my mind. This happened a few months ago, and people, I've expressed this before on the channel occasionally, and people have asked me why I changed my mind. And so I thought I would just do a quick video now going over the reasons. I assume that people watching this understand the distinction between non-cognitivism and error theory. If not, I do have a series on metaethics that you can go and check out. But, so briefly, the non-cognitivist position is that moral judgments do not express beliefs, and that moral judgments are not propositions, so they're not the sort of things that can be true or false. When you say that abortion is wrong, that's more like saying, for instance, boo to abortion. It's an expression of an attitude rather than an expression of a belief. So for the non-cognitivist, moral judgments have a mind-to-world direction of fit rather than a world-to-mind direction of fit. A belief is something that tries to represent what's going on out there in the world, right? It tries to represent the facts. When I believe that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth, I'm sort of letting my mental representations of the world be guided by the way I take the world to be. On the other hand, at least from the point of view of a non-cognitivist, when we make a judgment like abortion is wrong, if you make that judgment, but if somebody makes a judgment such as abortion is wrong, that's not really representing the facts. Instead, it's an expression of attitude, right, towards particular things. It's an expression of an attitude that this person has towards abortion. Boo to abortion. So the non-cognitivist will say that abortion is wrong, although it has the kind of surface form of a proposition. It's not really a proposition. It's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. I'm really speaking in very general and simple terms here because like I say, this isn't. I'm not doing an in-depth lecture on these things. So this is very simplified, but that's non-cognitivism. On the other hand, the error theorist will say that moral judgments do express beliefs. Moral judgments are propositional. They're just all false, right? Because there are no moral values, there are no moral facts. So abortion is wrong is false because there's no such thing as wrongness. Giving to charity is good is false because there's no such thing as moral goodness. You ought to give to charity is false because there's no fact of the matter about what you morally ought to do. Those are the positions. And I used to be a non-cognitivist. I became an error theorist. So why was this? Well, first of all, there are just the kind of standard reasons to favour error theory, which I've always been aware of. Error theory does offer a simpler account of the semantics of moral discourse. So I don't, there are various technical problems for non-cognitivism, like the Frege-Geach problem. I don't actually think these problems are as serious as many people seem to take them to be, but they are still problems, and they're problems that don't really arise for an error theorist. Error theory does seem to be more in line with what people think they are doing when they make moral judgments. I don't know if that matters that much, right? So the mere fact that people take themselves to be expressing propositions, or the mere fact that people take moral judgments to be expressing beliefs, attempting to describe reality, that's a reason to favour error theory, but I don't think that accounts of the meanings of a particular area of discourse should just be a matter of what people take themselves to be doing when they engage in that discourse. Hopefully that makes sense. So, I always granted, even when I was a non-cognitivist, that a lot of people, when they make moral judgments, take themselves to be expressing beliefs, but the kind of philosophical account of what's happening when we engage in a particular discourse it's not just determined by what people take themselves to be doing when they engage in that discourse. But even so, these are reasons to at least find something like error theory attractive. Okay, so the more fundamental reason why I changed my mind, though. So I never proposed non-cognitivism as the correct account of the meaning of moral statements. I don't think there really is any correct account of that, because I think that in general meaning is indeterminate. So I see a lot of philosophy as being a matter of conceptual engineering, where we take everyday concepts that are vague, messy, imprecise, and then we revise those concepts to make them more precise, and in such a way that they can still fulfill the same functions that they fulfilled before, or at least in such a way that they can still fulfill certain functions that we might want them to fulfill. Morality, the practice of making moral judgments, I take that to be a fairly useful institution. It's something that's worth preserving. But I think that, when people make moral judgments, like the actual, there's a whole bunch of different things they might be doing. Like sometimes they might well be expressing beliefs, but sometimes they're just expressing attitudes. If you think about people going to a protest, for instance, like getting fired up, right? Going out like at a protest, they're really mad about something. That's something like, and they might be making moral statements while they're doing this, and that's something that seems to be more like an expression of emotion, or an expression of attitude rather than an expression of belief. So there's a kind of this practice of making moral judgments, it's vague, it's messy. Part of the job of philosophers is to clean it up. I have a video on conceptual engineering, if you've never encountered that particular philosophical method, but that's what I think a lot of philosophy is about, not just in metaethics, but just in general. So when I was a non-cognitivist, I only proposed it as as a kind of, as part of this conceptual engineering. It wasn't like, okay, descriptively, this is the correct account of moral discourse as it is. It was rather, moral discourse is kind of vague and confused, right? And one way we can make it more precise, and one way that I think is a very useful way of thinking about it, and one way of thinking about it that preserves the kind of roles we want it to play, is non-cognitivism, right? Like we should think of our moral judgments as expressions of attitudes rather than expressions of beliefs. Okay, so I still think that conceptual engineering is the right approach, but so one of the things that I would say is a kind of constraint on any project in conceptual engineering is that when we're doing this, when we're trying to develop a more precise formal account of some discourse, right, for the purpose of conceptual engineering, we should probably start with the most sophisticated instances of that discourse. Like you want to start with the cases of that discourse that are themselves best developed, and notice that's moral philosophy, right? So in the case of morality, the most sophisticated, well-developed area of moral discourse is moral philosophy. But moral philosophers generally take their judgments to be beliefs. Certainly, like, so certainly the cognitivist account of moral discourse is much more attractive if we're talking about moral discourse by moral philosophers than if we're just talking about, you know, the discourse of like people in a kind of everyday colloquial context. Again, right? So, you know, if you're looking at people like getting mad going to a protest, or if you're just, I don't know, sitting down, if you have a Christmas dinner and you have to meet members of your family that you haven't seen in a while, and you know they start talking about immigrants and they get mad about it. If in that kind of context, again, it seems like this might just be a matter of expressing attitudes and emotions, right? But these are not very sophisticated. This reminds me of this is a total tangent. Sorry about this, but there's a great line by Stuart Lee. The comedian Stuart Lee, where he says that he hates Christmas because he has to meet the rest of his family, and that means he has to agree with racism out of politeness. And that's a very amusing line. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so if you take those kinds of moral judgments, then yeah, you're going to find non-cognitivism attractive. But those are not really, that's not morality at its most sophisticated, right? If we take morality at its most sophisticated, then we should look at the work of moral philosophers. And with moral philosophers, you know, you don't get the like emotional expressions. You also see a kind of detachment. When philosophers engage in moral reasoning and moral discourse, right, they're kind of detached from like emotional aspect of morality, from the motivational aspect of morality. Philosophers will often explore positions just to kind of like sort of see, they'll be like, okay, let's imagine that this is the case, right? Let's suppose that this moral proposition is true. What follows from that? You know, they'll do that kind of thing. They'll explore positions rather than necessarily promote them. Now, of course, philosophers will also promote various moral views, but I think that when you look at academic philosophy, there is a degree of kind of detachment, and certainly it's much more attractive to look at that as involving beliefs or as involving propositions. So, within philosophy at least, within the most sophisticated area of this discourse, it looks like a cognitivist account is more appealing. So yeah, what I would say is that the kinds of cases that make non-cognitivism appealing are distinct from the kinds of cases that provide the best ground on which to begin the project of conceptual engineering. So this is one factor that kind of pushed me more towards the error theorist position. You know, once I got more clear in my head about what the sort of methods of philosophy are, once I really began to endorse conceptual engineering, and I saw that this is something that or at least I think that I'm doing in a lot of different areas, yeah, that again sort of nudged me towards error theory, because it nudged me towards cognitivism. More generally, there are a lot of areas that I will treat as involving the postulation of useful fictions. So there are many fields where I will say it's useful to treat false propositions as if they were true. And I mean, this actually is something that I would say, and have always said, well, not always, but have for a long time said, about propositions that are closely connected to moral discourse. For example, it's long been my position that there's not really much of a distinction between, on the one hand, a kind of pragmatist compatibilism about free will, and on the other hand, the view that free will is just non-existent, but it's useful to talk as if we had free will. Like it's useful to act as if people had that control over their actions, right? Like I've often thought it just doesn't really matter. So, you know, with free will, like I'm happy to see that as a useful fiction. But But, you know, free will is something that is connected to concepts of moral responsibility, right? So it's closely connected to moral discourse. You know, within that area, right, like, I'm happy to take a cognitivist line on it and to say it's a matter of we're dealing with propositions that are false. And this is something that I, as I mentioned, say in a lot of different cases now. So, you know, in the sciences, we find scientists constantly appealing to idealizations. And as a scientific anti-realist, I'm going to take the line that actually a lot of that much of the content of our best scientific theories involves useful fictions. So, you know, taking moral propositions to be useful fictions coheres quite nicely with this more general approach. You know, I guess it's that I have an error theory stance in many other domains, right? And then again, you know, once I realised that being a non-cognitivist about morality specifically just started to stick out. You know, it didn't seem to cohere very nicely with the philosophical views I'd developed elsewhere. Okay, so those are some general reasons. I mean, more specifically, it's just that many of the arguments for non-cognitivism started to lose their force. One thing that, you know, one of the reasons that I felt attracted to non-cognitivism, how would be the best way? So, a good way to express this is what I like to call the moral property detector argument, right? So, here's the idea. Suppose that we were to develop a moral property detector, right? So this is a very crude idea, but you know, hopefully it makes the point. So, you know, suppose we were, I mean, in a way, I'm saying, you know, let's imagine like the best case scenario for a moral realist, right? Let's imagine, right, that we literally did have an instrument, right, that could detect moral properties in the same way as we have, you know, microscopes and telescopes and Geiger counters and so on. Like, somebody manages to actually build an instrument, right, that measures moral value or moral properties, right? So this instrument, you point it at various actions, and then there's like a needle that moves left or right. You point it at somebody being enslaved, and the needle moves to the left, moves like hard to the left. You point it at someone being murdered, it moves hard to the left. You point it at somebody giving to charity, the needle moves to the right. So we find that this moral property detector, it tracks very well our kind of intuitive judgments of right and wrong. You know, so let's just assume that we have good reason to think that this moral property detector is actually detecting the objective moral properties. And I should point out that if you want to respond to this by saying that this is just, you know, nonsensical or incoherent, or you can't imagine how there could possibly be such a thing as a moral property detector, it is worth noting that, at least from a realist point of view, that's what humans are, isn't it? I mean, it seems like there are moral property detectors from a realist point of view. It's us. But yeah, so I'm just saying, imagine that we actually did have this instrument, and we had good reason to think that it was reliably detecting objective moral properties. But then we point it at somebody engaging in homosexual behaviour, and the needle moves to the left. So it's telling us that this is very morally wrong. It's telling us that this is something that, yeah, it's like, it's as bad as slavery, it's as bad as murder. So, you know, I come to form the belief, right, that it's an objective fact that homosexuality is morally wrong. Now, the problem is that this doesn't seem to change anything. Like, this doesn't really seem to change the content of my own moral judgments. So I find that, you know, when I try to imagine myself in this situation, I mean, my position, just to be clear, is there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. And the point is, when I imagine myself in this situation, I keep making that judgment. Even if I would say, okay, there's somehow an objective fact, it's somehow an objective fact that homosexuality is morally wrong, this doesn't move me at all. Like, I'm not going to I'm not going to say that people ought not to engage in homosexual behaviour. I'm not going to try to stop anybody from engaging in homosexual behaviour. I'm not going to try to discourage it, you know. I'm going to carry on encouraging people to be wild and deviant. And like, I would say, well, I just don't care what the objective facts are then. If it's the case that it's a fact about, you know, if it's a fact that homosexuality is morally wrong, that actually doesn't move me any more than encountering another person who thinks that homosexuality is morally wrong. So I kind of want to say, like, why should I care? You know, like if I meet another person who says that homosexuality is morally wrong, I don't care about that, right? So why should it make any difference to me whether it's this other person judging that homosexuality is morally wrong, or whether it's the universe somehow judging that homosexuality is morally wrong? Like, I don't care. I don't have a problem with homosexuality. So, you know, the point of this thought experiment was, it seemed to me that what's important about morality is this practical role, right? Like, we're not really okay. So if our moral judgments were beliefs, right? If we were trying to, if our moral judgments were trying to represent facts about the world, then if we came to, you know, if we had this, then in this scenario where we have a moral property detector, right, our moral judgments should then match that. But I would say that would make no difference. What seemed to me to really matter about morality then was its, you know, practical role in organising our societies, and, you know, objective values can't tell us how to do that. So that was one of the reasons why I found non-cognitivism attractive. I no longer find that particular reason convincing, and the reason is that it seems that the same kind of argument can be run against a whole bunch of other claims or a whole bunch of other judgments, judgments that do clearly seem to be beliefs or do clearly seem to be propositions. So imagine if God comes down and tells me that actually a whole bunch of my judgments about the external world are systematically mistaken. Like, maybe there just are no objects in the external world. For instance, I seem to be talking at a computer, you know, so I believe that there is a computer in front of me. I believe that there's a cup filled with water to the side of me. I believe that my car's parked outside, etc. But actually, this is just all false. Okay, so God has come down and has given me convincing reasons to think that I'm just systematically deceived. So now the problem is that wouldn't actually change anything about the judgments that I make, or, you know, the discourse that I engage in with others. So, like, at the end of the day, even if I come to think that, like, there just are no cars, there are no computers, there are no cups filled with water, like, I can't stop talking about cars and computers and cups and so on. And, you know, when I interact with other people, I'd still say, like, hey, let's go and get in the car. Is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car. I would still engage in that kind of discourse. So basically, yeah, I could come to believe that there are no objects, but I'd still engage in object discourse in the same. So you know, it's the same kind of thing as is going on in the moral property detector case, right? Like, you know, I could come to, like, I come to believe, right, that there's an objective fact that homosexuality is morally wrong, but I don't change anything about my moral discourse, right? And so I had that as a kind of as one of the reasons that made me attracted to non-cognitivism. But then I realised, well, I could come to believe that my judgments about objects are mistaken, but I'd carry on talking about objects in the same kind of way. and I'm very sure that my judgments about objects are beliefs. I mean, they seem like to say, for instance, that there is a computer in front of me. That's just a like if that's not a belief, what the hell is? You know. So yeah, hopefully you can see my point, right? Like there were reasons that made non-cognitivism attractive to me that lost their force. So this was another thing that pushed me away from non-cognitivism. Another important point, and I mean, you know, this is something I guess I've sort of always been aware of, but you know, it's worth mentioning, is that actually we can capture many of the motivations for non-cognitivism within error theory, now that we have the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. So, you know, if I'm having an argument with somebody and I shout, "There's the door," well, "there's the door" is a proposition which is either true or false. And it's like, when I shout, "There's the door," right, I'm expressing a proposition which is either true or false. But I'm not just expressing a proposition which is either true or false, I'm also using that to express an emotion or express a command. So when I shout, "There's the door," I'm expressing an emotion of anger. I'm expressing the command, "Get out of the room," right? But I'm using a proposition in order to achieve that effect. So there's the semantics, right? The semantics is that "there's the door" is a proposition which is either true or false, right? It attributes a particular object to a particular location, right? That's the semantics. But then the pragmatics is, well, it's being used to express an emotion, to express a command, or something else. And I mean, obviously, you can apply the same idea to moral statements, right? Moral statements are propositions which are either true or false. As it happens, they're all false because there are no moral facts. You know, there are no moral values. There is no fact about what you ought and ought not to do morally. But they're propositions, right? Abortion is wrong, attributes the property of wrongness to abortion, but those propositions are used to express various other mental states. They're used to express emotions, attitudes, commands, whatever. So, you know, we just don't need to take emotions, attitudes, commands as constituting the meaning of moral statements in the way that non-cognitivism does, right? We can capture the motivation for non-cognitivism within error theory. So those are the main reasons. There is a final point which is worth mentioning. I have long had a distaste for the developments in the non-cognitivist tradition, as it has been in contemporary philosophy over the last few decades, right? Like I when I read people like A.J. Ayer, he's really cool, right? I like those early non-cognitivists, but more modern non-cognitivists, they just kind of piss me off. In particular, I really don't like the way that almost all non-cognitivists have embraced this kind of quasi-realist weaseling. Like they have tranquilized non-cognitivism. You know, when A.J. Ayer first proposed non-cognitivism, right, it was a really radical position. It's like, yeah, moral claims, they just have no truth value. They're pretty much just meaningless, right? Like, that's it. They just express emotion. They're neither true nor false. That's it. But the more modern defenders of non-cognitivism have tried to make all of these concessions to realists. They've said, if you adopt a deflationary theory of truth, then we can say that actually moral statements are truth apt just in virtue of their form. And actually maybe even some moral statements are true. And maybe even it's legitimate to talk about moral properties and moral facts and all of this. And it's actually to the point now where there's quite a lot of literature which questions whether there is even a distinction between non-cognitivist quasi-realism and straightforward realism, right? Like, it's no longer at all obvious how to even distinguish the sophisticated non-cognitivist from the realist, and this is just an absolute tragedy. It disgusts me, that this has happened to what was a really cool position, and all of these concessions have been made to we should not be making any concessions to moral realists, right? Moral realism is okay. Moral realism is a perfectly legitimate position for people to hold. There are very intelligent defences of moral realism, right? I'm well aware of that, you know. In fact, I think that there's a minor consensus in favour of realism, or at least there was on the last Phil Papers survey. But I don't want to be making any concessions to realists, and it annoys me that non-cognitivists have done that, and error theorists don't seem to have done that, right? Like, error theorists are like, nope, there are no moral facts, no moral properties, moral judgments, all false, right? I like that position a lot more. That's closer to my heart. And of course, the other thing is that in the course of making all of these concessions to realists, this has required non-cognitivists to engage in a whole bunch of really, like, what I think are quite dull technical problems, like the Frege-Geach problem. I mean, this point isn't, this isn't an argument against non-cognitivism, but it's something that, it probably has pushed me away from non-cognitivism. At the end of the day, I like error theory more than I like non-cognitivism. At least, I like error theory more than I like non-cognitivism after about 1970. That's it. I think that explains why I changed my mind, why I am no longer a non-cognitivist.